Welcome to Holt. We're rather proud of our small North Norfolk town's character. There are alleyways, yards, galleries, eateries, numerous independent shops, and of course schools, as well as a few attractions that might just hark back to a simpler time. But when the town's streets are free of the hustle and bustle of daily life, it's easier to step back in time. It's 5 a.m, and to quote Dylan Thomas, all the people of the lulled and dumbfound town are sleeping now, which means that we can have some peace and quiet to enjoy the architecture and revisit the past. So it's the perfect time to have a stroll through the town with our Holt Society historian, Steve Benson. Now, please sit back and enjoy a stroll through Georgian Holt. An early view of Holt Marketplace, showing Blind Sam, the ornate gas lamp, on the left. This was moved to the other end of the High Street to make way for the War Memorial in 1921. Steve will talk more about both Blind Sam and the War Memorial later. I suspect that given the modes of transport and of course the lady's attire, the date of this photo may even be earlier, possibly circa 1900. Many of the buildings are architecturally the same today, but the uses have, in some cases, changed.
This is the marketplace. Very important, as you can see, the breadth of it here. Just imagine it in the Middle Ages, lots of wattle and daub, thatched buildings, scattered around here, and also further up towards the church, because of course the church was the centre of everything in those very early days. But what we notice looking at the buildings around the marketplace are the buildings have a similarity between them because they're nearly all built in the 18th century after the terrible event of 1708, when the Great Fire of Holt took place. The marketplace was full of wooden stalls, perhaps with sort of skins, tarpaulins, and somehow, on this lovely, bright, very breezy day, the fire took place, probably a knocked-over brazier or something like that. But whatever happened, it all shot up, and then, of course, spread by the wind up the Church Street here, down the High Street. They reckon about 80 houses in Holt altogether were destroyed. Nobody was killed and nobody was even injured, which was pretty amazing, really. But it was a total disaster and the town was devastated. It very quickly, though, recovered as a result of a brief, as they used to call it, which was a document which allowed the town to raise money from other parishes throughout the country, and gradually the buildings were restored and the town grew and the marketplace with its buildings around and the High Street developed. And nearly all of them had the same architecture, of course, because they were built in the same period in the 18th century, the Georgian period. So this is a lovely Georgian town. The War Memorial was placed there just after the war ended, and the names of all the fallen in the First and Second World Wars, and indeed a couple of people from wars thereafter. What brings it home to me is the number of names when you consider the very small size of the town. I know this was common, but it just shows you what a tremendous damage it did to the population and to the families and the people of these villages and towns. This building here is probably the best example of the Georgian architecture in all its glory. If you look closely up at the top, you can just make out in black brick the date, 1744. Which shows you that some of the greater buildings were created quite a long time after the fire. The reason why I'm coming here is because so much of the town is flint and brick. And I rather like looking at the flint and brick. If it's in rows, neatly done, rather posh, cost a bit of money, then that would have been what they called coarse walling. If you come a bit further into this little yard here, and you see other parts of the buildings, this one here or there, and you can see they're thrown together, bits of brick, bits of, you don't need to bother about it. The front's what matters, not the side and not the rear. And you also see these bricked-in windows, which show that buildings were often used for different purposes. And of course there was, in various times in British history, there was the window tax. And if you didn't want to pay too much on your windows, then you bricked it in.
At the east end of the marketplace, we have the location of the manor house belonging to Sir John Gresham, shown here in this lovely line drawing. The building was the first location of Sir John Gresham's grammar school. As a former head of history at the school, I will let Steve explain more.
This building, the old school house as it is known, was actually an old manor house built in the 15th century of the Gresham family, hence the name of the school, Gresham's School. This building itself is the rebuild of the old manor house, which was fallen to pieces, and in the 1850s they rebuilt. Here now is the home of the pre-prep, that's to say the little ones, and the main buildings of Gresham School are further along the Cromer Road. Very important to the town, a thriving school, and I think it's good for Holt, and Holt is certainly good for it. But here we have the real heart, in a way, of the town, the old schoolhouse. It's amazing how many pubs there were in Holt, even in the 18th and 19th centuries. Total population of Holt was probably no more than 1,800, and considerably less at times. And yet, certainly at the height of the Victorian period, there were probably as many as 10 or 11 pubs. But if you think about the population was, say, 1,500, and maybe half of them being men, because the women, of course, didn't go to the alehouses and the pubs, and then you've got at least half of those would have been children. You've got about 300 men and 11 pubs, which isn't a bad ratio, really, when you think about it. But, of course, we mustn't forget that the majority of people living in the town would have been working on the land, so maybe they deserved it. The White Lion pub on the far side of the street, lovely building there, that was built just after the Great Fire in the very early 18th century, one of the earliest to be put up there.
Being on the main road, would that have been a coaching inn?
Yes, that was definitely a coaching inn. There were several inns. We'll see one or two more as we go around. Just as we go along, the lovely little Praise Cottage here. It's a beautiful little cottage. I just love the doorway, and it's classic again of its period. And that would have been an 18th century building. The latticed windows, the doorway. Feathers Hotel is probably the most famous building in Holt. Dates back to certainly the time of the fire, if not before, and was the big coaching inn of the area. And behind it was the cattle market, right through from early days, right up until the 1960s, when it stopped, because the railway was cut by Dr. Beeching and his famous axe. So livestock market came with the railways in the 1880s and stopped in about 1960.
The closure of Holt Station and the removal of the track under the beaching cuts of the 1960s changed the face of Holt. Whilst this certainly influenced the closure of the market, it also provided a location for a later bypass around Holt. This certainly reduced the traffic in the town centre, which of course enhanced the safety for pedestrians. However, in 1965, work commenced to reopen a disused part of the track between Sheringham and Holt, and today this is a very successful heritage railway and tourist attraction.
Morning.
Thank you.
Don't take no notice of us. There's over there, incidentally, is Hopper's Yard, one that was named after a person rather than an occupation, if you like. And this is called the Old Paul Pry. This was yet another of the pubs that we were talking about. Paul Pry was a play written in the 1820s which took over the country from London and then went out to the provinces, Norwich and so on and so forth, and obviously reached here, at least by reputation. And it told the story of a little old busybody who used to go around everybody's houses looking in and checking. And you can see the figure of the man. He had an umbrella apparently always under his arm, which he left behind in places so that he could always go back and be a busybody again. Oh, I'm sorry, I've left my umbrella. And then his great catchword was, "I hope I don't intrude."
The pub closed in the 1950s, and we think the date of the photograph is around 1917, as the young man with his basket and trap is Reg Crow, who back in 1917 worked as a baker's boy at the local Hempstead Mill. Today, as you can see, its exterior remains very much as it was then.
Looking up here, we see, perhaps we don't see, why this Bull Street, named after the pub, was once known as Tower Street, because there was a big water tower standing alongside this lovely building here with its sort of fan window at the top there, which is the Shire Hall. Hence this is known as Shire Hall Plain. The water was pumped up from the Spout Hills, which we'll visit and have a look at a little bit later on. It was put up in the 1880s, and it wasn't removed from the town until about 1960. The Shire Hall, the white building on the right, that's very much a Georgian building, and that dates back to the days of the shires. We're going back to sort of Saxon periods. The point being that the Shire Hall would have been the place where you had your magistrates' courts of the period. Not every town would have had a Shire Hall. Holt was important because it was a centre of justice in the Middle Ages, and it is rather extraordinary that this little town of ours was, way back in the time of Edward the Confessor and William the Conqueror, was an important place. Because it was a crossroads, it had its well, its spring, and it was a royal manor, so it's an important place in those days.
I think the magistrates' court lasted until about 1970s as
Indeed,
well, didn't it?
indeed
Yes,
it did.
that's not...
Indeed it did.
They're lovely hollyhocks, aren't they?
Yes. It's rather splendid, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here we have a photograph around 1916 of the Methodist Free Church, which stands at the end of the High Street opposite Obelisk Plain. Built in the Gothic style in 1863 at a cost of £2,000, this was made possible by a generous local benefactor. The cart is thought to belong to Mr. Peck, a flower dealer in nearby Edgefield.
Methodism was very strong in Norfolk, and indeed there were in Holt at least 3 different types of Methodist chapel, and the church itself, of course, was for the rather more middle-class people to go to, but the vast majority of the working class, as you would have called them then, would attend at the Methodist chapels. Nice little thing here. The lion couchant there, sitting very low down, was once a pediment on the top of this building here, and you can just make out at the top there the 2 supports which would have been there to hold up the lion, but at some stage they decided that it was too dangerous, so they brought it down, but they didn't want to get rid of it, so they plonked it on the side, and there it stands. We're now on Obelisk Plain, so called because of the pillar, if you like, there, which was supposed to have been a gatepost for Melton Constable Park, and on it you can see the mileage between, supposedly, Melton Constable Park and the various other places. The other obelisk went to Dereham, and during the Second World War, Dereham, in order to prevent the Germans from having any assistance when they landed, decided that they would throw theirs down into a well, which they did and destroyed it. And our people were much more cunning. They just simply whitewashed over the sign and then left it there, which I thought was rather clever. Next to the obelisk is what we call Blind Sam. Now, Blind Sam was a gas lamp with a fountain below for horses and so on and so forth. It was raised in 1887, the Queen Victoria, that is, Golden Jubilee, and it's a rather fine thing, but it had to be moved to accommodate the War Memorial, which was built at the far end of the marketplace in the 1920s and 1921. You may ask why Blind Sam. Well, the answer is that it very rarely, apparently, was lit. That may have been because of the lack of gas or the unreliability of the gas, or it might have been because the lamplighter couldn't reach that far. Something like that, anyway.
Turning back to the other end of the High Street, we see Barber Brown and his apprentice standing in their aprons outside the barber's shop. This is now a newsagent, and the only real change to this scene is the loss of the adjacent building with its bay window. This was replaced with a modern building housing a bank, but has now been converted into a specialist coffee, chocolate and Italian ice cream shop. Clearly everyone wanted to be in the picture and looked towards the camera, except the dog, of course, who continues to focus on his master.
Rather splendid little building. I was talking about Methodism, and that was what they called the primitive. I'm never quite sure why, but the primitive Methodists went there. I have a vision of what the primitive Methodist looks like, but I'm not sure. Here too, you can see that it was a chapel. It's got the windows look like it and so on. But it was also, of all things, a fire station at one stage, and we do have a photograph of the fire engine in there.
Yes, you can see where the brickwork has taken out the entrance to the fire station.
You're quite right. You can see the newer brick. That was where the fire engine went in.
And my understanding is that was taken out of there because the fire engine was too big to go in there when they replaced it.
Well,
so,
there you go, yeah. This little row there of cottages, the core of them is probably 16th century, and they definitely date back to Elizabethan times. And we come to a real gem here. We were talking about Methodism. Another of the Methodist churches, the Wesleyan Church, we see over here, opened in the year of Victoria's accession to the throne, or just after, and now turned into flats. And behind it, the Methodist Memorial Garden. It was, of course, a graveyard at one stage, but it's now been turned into a lovely little green spot for people to come, sit, ponder, and have their lunch. And in it you will see at the far side quite an interesting carving, a Welsh slate stone, on which we have written out, or have had written out, an entry from the Domesday Book. Domesday Book, you'll remember from your school days, was William the Conqueror's attempt to find out exactly what he'd conquered. He'd conquered about 20 years after he landed. It was a fantastic document which was placed into 2 books. And it went through the whole of the country, checking to see what was there for taxation purposes. It tells you how many different types of unfree man there were in Holt, the number of cows, the number of pigs, mills, and also that it had its own port, which is pretty amazing really for a town which is well inland. The port of Cley, which was part, if you like, of the manor of Holt, which again shows its importance that it had its own port. So there we go. We are an important place, or we were then. And there's a little sign at the side which gives a bit of detail about a bit of some of the more obscure words in the panel. Anyway, we're pleased with that, and it works quite well, I think. This row of cottages, 8 cottages here, very early Victorian, 1840s perhaps, one of the joys of Holt. and it's called Blue Stone Row, and there is an element of blue, as you can see, in the pebbles. Just ordinary workers' cottages, I think, but very beautifully done. And you can see there, incidentally, how some of the windows have been blocked out. Again, I think probably to save money.
And they're listed as well?
Almost all the buildings of any age in Holt are Grade 2 listed.
Over 100 listed buildings, aren't
Yeah.
they? Yeah.
It's amazing. Noticing the name Owl on the owl tea rooms here reminds me of the little story of why the population of Holt is called the Holt Owls. It's a story really against the people of Holt. They thought they were rather superior, for good reasons, of course. But once upon a time, in Victorian times, two young boys found an owl wandering about in the streets. And they decided they would put the owl into the pound, which was an open space for stray cattle and things, hoping to claim it the next day. The point is that when they arrived there the next morning, do you know, the owl had gone? And which of course is the story of why perhaps not all the people of Holt are quite so clever as they think they are. Get it? Right. This building in front of us is an interesting building, but nothing very special about it, except that it's now the town library. But once in the middle of the 19th century, it was a stables. And in 1882-3, to the town came a rather remarkable man. He'd been shipped out as a young man to the Crimean War, 1854-5, and had been present at the charge of the Light Brigade. And in the charge of the Light Brigade, this man, James Ollie, had been wounded 5 times. He lost an eye, and yet he managed to survive not only his wound, but the journey home and back into civilian life. He was a son of a farm labourer, and he became a farm labourer. And 30 years later, married with a big family, he found himself out of a job and very nearly in the workhouse. Fortunately, he was picked out by a local landowner who found that he was a hero of the charge of the Light Brigade and decided that he would do something for him, raised money to put him in some form of employment. He was a horseman, of course, I've said, and his stables were here. And he trained horses for Lord Hastings and various other grandees of the local area. There are lots of stories about him. He was quite a good drinker. He had the odd punch-up at horse fairs at Little Aldborough village along the road here, but was a man of enormous courage and strength, and he managed to survive up until his late 80s and died in 1920, would you believe, even surviving the First World War as well. A rather remarkable man, James Ollie, and it's good to have the chance to mention him as one of the heroes of Holt. Spout Hills, absolutely lovely green spot, common land dating back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, with the trickling River Glaven running through a valley at the bottom. On the way down, you find a pond, or it appears to be a pond, but as you get closer you can hear running water, and out of a spout, a pipe, is coming constant supply of clean water from wells way down beneath the surface. There are a number of spouts, hence the Spout Hills. And of course this supplied fresh water for the people of Holt for generations, and certainly was one of the reasons for early settlements of Holt, which probably predate Roman times. In Victorian times, you would have seen at the bottom, by the river, a pumping station which pumped up water to the water tower, which I've already mentioned, for many years. Eventually, when Holt was put on the mains, there was no longer any need for that. One further thing about the spouts, it was a place where great ceremonies took place when celebrations were needed. It was a huge area where all the people of Holt and surrounding villages could gather. And there was one particular event in 1814, after the first defeat of Napoleon, and before Waterloo and the 100 days and leading up to Waterloo, when they thought they'd defeated Napoleon, but they hadn't, because they put him on Elba, which was about a stone's throw from France, to which he returned, of course. And in 1814, a huge celebration dinner and games and so on was organised. Extraordinary. Tables of 70 people, each with their own president, where they did all the cooking was all organised. People marched. They had 17 toasts at the dinner, and afterwards they had these wonderful games, including rolling down the side of the Spout Hills. There was one lovely one where the ladies rolled down for a purse of some kind, and they, of course, had to tie their petticoats to their legs so the ankles would not be seen by anybody else. And there were all sorts of other games to be played. 1814 this was. They even produced a little pamphlet on it and all the rest of it. A huge organisation, completely ruined by the fact that old Boney came back again. And I noticed that they did not have another celebration in 1815. One was quite enough. Looking up towards the church now, this of course was in the Middle Ages, as I have said, the centre of the village life, probably surrounded by huts and hovels. Majority of the ordinary folk would have lived there because the church and its tower would have been a place for sanctuary if they were attacked by anybody, and so they could all pile into the church and lock the doors and probably remain safe. Possibly the Great Fire burnt a lot of hovels which may have still have been there. They were able to reconstruct the church eventually, which was damaged, although not totally destroyed. But what we do know is that instead of having the centre there around the church, like a medieval village would have probably had, they moved out and into the Holt that we know today, with its lovely Georgian buildings and its marketplace and high street and side streets and yards. A lovely place indeed.
Thank you, Steve, for an excellent and fascinating stroll, and sincere apologies for getting you up before 5 a.m, but I think it was worth it. We hope that you, the viewer, have also found this interesting, and as a result we look forward to seeing some of you in our beautiful North Norfolk town of Holt. If you have young children, or simply want a slightly different walk, then please do take a look at the Holt Owl Trail on the internet, or pick up a booklet available from most shops in Holt. You can also find more information both on the Holt Society and the town by typing Love Holt into your internet browser. But of course, there's nothing better than a visit in person. Thank you.